13.2, Respiration, Pulmonary Ventilation. Respiration actually means many different things. Pulmonary ventilation, which we will be discussing in this segment, is inspiration and expiration. So this is the movement of gases into and out of the lungs. But also respiration includes external respiration and internal respiration, which are some exchanges of gas that take place, and cellular respiration, which was the topic of an earlier lesson. Pulmonary ventilation is simply breathing. It's the movement of gases or air into and out of the lungs. Pulmonary ventilation is controlled by the respiratory center. This is in the medulla oblongata of the brain. The medulla causes us to breathe anywhere from 12 to 20 times per minute is average for an adult. The respiratory center monitors carbon dioxide concentration in the blood and also pH. And so we can adjust the rate of breathing or the depth of breathing as needed. There are also some chemoreceptors in the aorta and in the carotid artery, and these do keep up with oxygen concentration. So if oxygen concentrations fall too low, these can send signals to the respiratory center of the medulla to increase respiration. Inspiration is, of course, inhaling. This is moving gases into the respiratory system. This occurs because the respiratory center in the medulla is going to send a nerve impulse to the intercostal muscles. These are the muscles between the ribs, and as these intercostal muscles contract, that elevates the rib cage. Also, the diaphragm contracts. Now this is a little unusual because the diaphragm, when it contracts, it actually drops down. And so if the rib cage is elevated and the diaphragm drops down, that is going to increase the volume inside the thoracic cavity. Also, the lungs are covered by a pleura, little thin membrane, and there is a thin membrane on the inside of the rib cage as well. There's a little bit of fluid between these membranes, and so there is some surface tension between these membranes. So if the ribs elevate, that also elevates the lungs. So if we increase thoracic volume, we also will increase lung volume. The lungs are going to expand. Anytime we increase the volume of a closed system or a closed container, if you increase the volume, that's going to cause the gas pressure inside that to decrease. So as we raise the ribs, drop the diaphragm, the volume increases, the pressure then decreases, and so the pressure is higher in the air surrounding the body than it is inside the lungs, and so air simply rushes into the lungs. Expiration or exhaling is just the opposite. Those intercostal muscles are going to relax. That allows the rib cage to drop back down. The diaphragm relaxes, and so the relaxed diaphragm is dome-shaped. So this is going to decrease the volume inside the rib cage, and that will cause the pressure to increase, and so now the pressure is higher inside the lungs than it is outside. Respiratory volumes, we can measure how much air actually moves into and out of the cells. This diagram is a spirograph, which is a measurement of various respiratory volumes. And so right in the middle of the diagram, you see something called the tidal volume. The tidal volume is equal to the amount of air that we move in and out during quiet, restful breathing. So this is just shallow, restful breaths, about 500 or 600 mils of air that we move in. And so you see the blue line there as that increases, that is inspiration and then expiration. Inspiration, expiration. Well, obviously, we can inhale more than that. And so the inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that we can inhale above tidal volume. And so the peak that we see up here represents the maximum inhalation, all the air that you can get in. Likewise, we can exhale more, and so the expiratory reserve volume is that volume of air that we can forcibly exhale below tidal volume. Well, if we add tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve plus the expiratory reserve, that is equal to our vital capacity. And this is important because that represents the maximum amount of air that any individual can move, would be their vital capacity. Physical activity is limited by how much oxygen we can deliver to muscles. Remember, we have to have that oxygen for cellular respiration to produce ATP. And so a person's vital capacity is important, and that's going to, in some part, determine how much physical activity they can partake in. Down at the bottom of the diagram, we have something called the residual volume. Even when we forcibly exhale all of the air that we can possibly force out of the lungs, there's still about 1,200 milliliters of air inside the lungs. The lungs are never empty. If the lungs were empty, they would collapse, and those walls of those alveoli would collapse together. And remember, due to the surface tension, it would be very difficult for us to take that next breath. So the lungs are never empty. We always do have this residual volume.